The Nuremberg Code. During World War II, the Axis powers did a great deal of human experimentation. Both Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany subjected human beings to torturous ordeals in order to obtain data that might prove useful in their war effort. When the Allies were victorious in Asia, the U.S. government made a secret deal with Japanese scientists. In return for use of Japanese data, the United States would shield these scientists from prosecution. This was not the case in Europe. Distrust between the Soviet Union and the Allies forced much of the aftermath of the Nazi regime into the public eye. Many Nazi scientists were openly tried for war crimes. These trials were held in Nuremberg, Germany. At the time, one of the only cities in the country with a standing court building. Issued by the Nuremberg Military Tribunal in 1947, the Nuremberg Code is a 10-point statement meant to prevent future abuse of human subjects. It states that, above all, participation in research must be voluntary. The other points are as follows. The results of the research must be useful and unobtainable by other means. The study must be rationally based on knowledge of the disease or condition to be studied. It must avoid unnecessary suffering. The study cannot include death or disabling injury as a foreseeable consequence. Its benefits must outweigh its risks. The study must use proper facilities to protect participants. The study must be conducted by qualified individuals. Participants may withdraw from the study if they wish. Investigators must be prepared to stop the study should participants die or become disabled as a result of participation. The Nuremberg Code was created by opining on the testimony of physician witnesses and was said to represent current thoughts on the topic of human experimentation. Although intended to refer to this particular trial, and never formally adopted by any state or international agency, the Nuremberg Code has been tremendously influential, becoming the basis of later documents that are highly relevant to research today. Medical Journal No. 7070, Volume 313. Page 1448, December 7, 1996. Introduction. The judgment by the War Crimes Tribunal at Nuremberg laid down 10 standards to which physicians must conform when carrying out experiments on human subjects in a new code that is now accepted worldwide. This judgment established a new standard of ethical medical behavior for the post-World War II human rights era. Amongst other requirements, this document enunciates the requirement of voluntary informed consent of the human subject. The principle of voluntary informed consent protects the right of the individual to control his own body. This code also recognizes that the risk must be weighed against the expected benefit and that unnecessary pain and suffering must be avoided. This code recognizes that doctors should avoid actions that injure human patients. The principles established by this code for medical practice now have been extended into general codes of medical ethics. The Nuremberg Code, 1947. Permissible medical experiments. The great weight of the evidence before us to effect that certain types of medical experiments on human beings, when kept within reasonably well-defined bounds, conform to the ethics of the medical profession, generally. The protagonists of the practice of human experimentation justify their views on the basis that such experiments yield results for the good of society that are unprocurable by other methods or means of study. All agree, however, that certain basic principles must be observed in order to satisfy moral, ethical and legal concepts. 1. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice, without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved, as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision. This latter element requires that before the acceptance of an affirmative decision by the experimental subject there should be made known to him the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment, the method and means by which it is to be conducted, all inconveniences and hazards reasonably to be expected, and the effects upon his health or person which may possibly come from his participation in the experiment. The duty and responsibility for ascertaining the quality of the consent rests upon each individual who initiates, directs, or engages in the experiment. It is a personal duty and responsibility which may not be delegated to another with impunity. 2. The experiment should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society, unprocurable by other methods or means of study, and not random and unnecessary in nature. 3. The experiment should be so designed, and based on the results of animal experimentation and a knowledge of the natural history of the disease or other problem under study, that the anticipated results justify the performance of the experiment. 4. The experiment should be so conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. 5. No experiment should be conducted where there is an a priori reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur, except, perhaps, in those experiments where the experimental physicians also serve as subjects. 6. The degree of risk to be taken should never exceed that determined by the humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved by the experiment. 7. Proper preparations should be made and adequate facilities provided to protect the experimental subject against even remote possibilities of injury, disability or death. 8. The experiment should be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons. The highest degree of skill and care should be required through all stages of the experiment of those who conduct or engage in the experiment. 9. During the course of the experiment, the human subject should be at liberty to bring the experiment to an end if he has reached the physical or mental state where continuation of the experiment seems to him to be impossible. 10. During the course of the experiment, the scientist in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage if he has probable cause to believe in the exercise of the good faith, superior skill and careful judgment required of him that a continuation of the experiment is likely to result in injury, disability, or death to the experimental subject.
Think about all the Nuremberg Code guidelines that have been completely disregarded since beer-19 started in late 2019, in December of 2019. All the medical guidelines that have been disregarded by nurses, doctors, pharmacists, governments worldwide, the World Health Organization, pharmaceutical manufacturers, and so on. And politicians too, especially politicians. So I encourage you to read these guidelines again. I'll post the link in the comments section of the video.